the loudest, boldest land in America. Before the first Europeans set foot on the land was alive with the presence of its original inhabitants.
We have to fight and protect our land!
This land doesn't whisper history, it shouts it. Before the first Europeans set foot on the land that would become Texas, it was already home to diverse and complex cultures. From the dense forests to the sweeping plains, the land was alive with the presence of its original inhabitants. These were people who had lived on this land for thousands of years, each with their own customs, languages, and ways of life. The Caddo were one of the largest and most influential tribes in East Texas. They lived in permanent villages, built intricate earthen mounds, and cultivated crops such as maize, beans, and squash. Their sophisticated society was organized around a chiefdom system with strong spiritual beliefs and a rich tradition of art and trade. The Caddo were master potters, creating beautifully crafted vessels that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Meanwhile, to the west, the Apache roamed the vast arid regions of Texas. The Apache were nomadic hunters and warriors, known for their fearlessness and adaptability. Their main source of sustenance came from hunting bison, and they had a deep spiritual connection to the land. Their mobility was crucial, as it allowed them to move with the seasons and adapt to the ever-changing landscape of the Southwest. The Comanche, one of the most well-known Native American tribes in Texas history, lived on the plains. The Comanche were formidable horse riders, and their expert horsemanship gave them unparalleled advantages in battle and hunting. Their culture revolved around the bison hunt, and their ability to traverse the land quickly made them one of the most powerful tribes in North America. With their raids across Texas, they instilled fear in settlers, but they also played a significant role in shaping the history of the region. Though different in their ways of life, these tribes shared a profound connection to the land they called home. Their lives were centered around family, spirituality, and a respect for nature. The culture of the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, and the Cherokee, all of whom lived in various parts of Texas, further enriched the region's diverse indigenous heritage. They traded goods, exchanged stories, and developed unique traditions that would survive through centuries. The indigenous peoples of Texas had complex economies based on trade, agriculture, and hunting. Their daily lives were closely tied to the natural world. The Caddo grew crops, the Apache hunted, and the Comanche tracked bison. The exchange of goods, such as food, tools, clothing, and ceremonial objects, was vital to the survival and prosperity of the tribes. Trade networks extended far beyond Texas, reaching into what is now Mexico, the Great Plains, and even the Gulf Coast. These networks allowed the sharing of not only goods but also knowledge, stories, and technologies. The Native Americans of Texas were skilled traders, and they maintained relationships with neighboring tribes that helped strengthen their position in a sometimes hostile environment. Ceremonial life played a key role in the daily routines of these tribes. Religious practices, dances, and feasts were central to their culture. Many of these practices revolved around honoring the spirits of the earth and the animals they relied on for survival. The Comanche, for example, celebrated their bison hunts with elaborate ceremonies, recognizing the bison as sacred and integral to their survival. However, the introduction of European settlers and explorers would soon disrupt this delicate balance. The arrival of the Spanish brought with it new technologies, new diseases, and a new way of life that would change the landscape forever. With the Spanish came horses, guns, and tools that radically altered the way of life for many tribes. But these changes weren't all beneficial. In 1519, Spanish explorers led by Alonso Alvarez de Pineda mapped the Gulf Coast of Texas, setting the stage for further exploration and colonization. Over the next century, Spain sent expeditions into Texas, seeking to claim the land for the Spanish crown. But their presence was far from benign. The arrival of the Spanish brought not just new tools and trade goods, but also diseases, smallpox, measles, and influenza that decimated indigenous populations. Historians believe that the first wave of diseases wiped out up to 90% of the native population. Entire villages were devastated, and the tribes were left in a weakened state, struggling to survive. This was a slow, painful process that would continue for centuries as European settlers brought new illnesses to which the native people had no immunity. But the Spanish did not just bring disease, they also brought violence. The clash between the native tribes and the Spanish settlers was inevitable. The Spanish sought to subdue the indigenous peoples, forcing them into labor in the missions or on plantations. They sought to convert them to Christianity and bend them to their will, often with brutal force. The Apache and Comanche, both known for their fierce independence, fought back against the Spanish incursions. They resisted not just the Spanish, but also the encroaching European way of life. Despite being outgunned, these tribes used their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver their enemies, often launching surprise raids and guerrilla tactics to protect their way of life. The Spanish responded with force, burning villages and decimating any resistance they encountered. As the Spanish continued to settle Texas, the clash of cultures became more intense. The Comanche, Apache, and other tribes found themselves not just fighting for their lands, but for their very survival. Their way of life was threatened not only by Spanish colonization, but by the diseases and violence that accompanied it. For the indigenous peoples of Texas, the arrival of the Europeans marked the beginning of a long and painful period of displacement, loss, and war. While some tribes, like the Caddo, were eventually drawn into the Spanish mission system, many others resisted, leading to centuries of conflict that would shape the future of the region. The story of Texas before European contact is one of resilience, adaptation, and tragedy. The indigenous peoples who lived here developed deep, rich cultures that were intertwined with the land. But as the Europeans arrived, the world as they knew it began to crumble. The clash of cultures that began with the Spanish invasion would continue to echo through Texas's history, shaping the future of this vast and storied land. The story of Spanish exploration in Texas begins in the early 16th century, when the Spanish were eager to expand their empire in the New World. In 1519, Alonso Alferez de Pineda, a Spanish explorer, became the first European to map the coastline of what is now Texas. His journey was part of a broader mission to chart the Gulf Coast and assert Spanish territorial claims. However, Pineda's expedition was only the beginning of Spain's long and often turbulent history, with the land that would become Texas. The Spanish crown saw the New World as an opportunity to secure riches and expand its influence. Texas, though seemingly barren, compared to the lush, gold-filled lands of Mexico and South America, was still of great strategic interest. While the first Spanish explorers focused on the coastline, it wasn't long before the interior of the region began to lure other explorers. By 1528, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, part of a failed expedition, became the first European to set foot on the interior of Texas, marking the beginning of Spain's attempt to establish a more permanent presence in the region. Cabeza de Vaca's journey was one of survival and exploration. After being shipwrecked in Florida, he and his fellow survivors walked across what is now the American Southwest, including parts of Texas, where they encountered native groups such as the Karankawa and Caddo. Though Cabeza de Vaca did not establish settlements, his reports on the land, its people, and resources helped fuel Spanish interest in colonizing Texas. By the late 1600s, Spanish colonization efforts were firmly underway. The primary strategy for controlling Texas was to establish missions, religious outposts where Spanish priests sought to convert Native Americans to Christianity. The Spanish saw it as both a religious duty and a political strategy. Conversion to Catholicism would make the native populations loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. At the same time, presidios, military forts, were constructed to protect the missions from potential threats, both from hostile Native American tribes and rival European powers. The first successful mission was San Francisco de los Tejas, founded in 1690 near present-day Nacogdoches. This was the first permanent European settlement in Texas and marked the beginning of a long tradition of mission building. The mission system was intended to civilize the indigenous populations by teaching them European farming techniques, the Spanish language, and Catholic religious practices. The missionaries also taught the native peoples how to craft European-style goods, including pottery, tools, and clothing. The mission system was also part of a broader strategy to stake a claim over the land. Missions were typically located near rivers, which provided vital water resources for agriculture. By establishing missions in fertile areas, the Spanish hoped to build self-sustaining communities that would spread their influence across the region. Presidios, military forts, were established alongside missions to provide protection. These presidios served as defensive strongholds against the native populations, who often resisted Spanish encroachment. The Spanish soldiers stationed at these presidios were tasked with ensuring that the indigenous peoples adhered to the rules set out by the missions, which often led to tension and conflict. Despite Spain's best efforts, their mission system faced fierce resistance. Native tribes like the Apache, Comanche, and Karankawa saw the arrival of the Spanish as an invasion, not a religious or cultural exchange. The Caddo, for example, who lived in East Texas, were initially receptive to the Spanish, with some even converting to Christianity. However, their willingness to participate in the mission system was often under duress, and many still resented the foreign influence on their land and way of life. The Comanche, in particular, became one of the greatest challenges to Spanish colonization efforts. As horse riders and skilled warriors, the Comanche proved to be formidable enemies. The Spanish struggled to control them, as the Comanche adapted their traditional nomadic lifestyle to include raiding Spanish settlements and missions. They struck quickly, often burning missions and stealing livestock, and then retreating into the vast plains where the Spanish had little control. The Apache, another powerful force, had a similarly antagonistic relationship with the Spanish. They relied on raiding to sustain their way of life, and the Spanish missions represented an existential threat to their independence. As the Spanish pushed deeper into the land, they encountered not just individual tribes but entire confederacies, such as the Tonkawa, who actively resisted the imposition of Spanish rule. Despite resistance, the Spanish mission system expanded, particularly in San Antonio. By 1718, the Spanish established San Antonio de Padua, which became one of the most important settlements in Texas. San Antonio would later grow into the heart of Spanish Texas, and its missions, such as San Jose y San Miguel de Aguayo, became centers of not just religious activity but cultural exchange. The Spanish brought with them new technologies, most notably horses, which would change the dynamics of indigenous life. The introduction of horses by the Spanish would have a lasting impact on Native American cultures. Tribes like the Comanche quickly adapted to horseback riding, using it to raid Spanish settlements and strengthen their nomadic culture. However, horses also provided the native populations with a new means of hunting and warfare, giving them more leverage in their struggles against the Spanish. In addition to horses, the Spanish also introduced guns, metal tools, and European agricultural techniques. These innovations, however, came at a cost to the native peoples. As the Spanish sought to impose their systems of farming, religion, and governance, many of the indigenous peoples who resisted found themselves driven into conflict. The arrival of Spanish settlers, who began encroaching on native territories and claiming land, further exacerbated tensions. By the late 1700s, the Spanish mission system began to lose its grip on Texas. Native populations, worn down by disease and warfare, no longer had the strength to resist the Spanish or manage the demands of life within the missions. Many of the missions were abandoned, and the presidios, which had once served as vital centers of Spanish control, began to deteriorate. At the same time, the Spanish crown shifted its focus, redirecting its attention to more profitable colonies in Mexico and South America. Even as Spain's direct influence in Texas waned, the legacy of their presence remained. The missions, presidios, and settlements they left behind laid the foundation for the eventual colonization of Texas by Mexico and the United States. The Spanish legacy in Texas would be evident in its language, its culture, and even in the very land it claimed. In 1821, Mexico achieved its long-awaited independence from Spain. The birth of the Mexican Republic had profound implications not just for the nation, but for the future of Texas, a region caught in the crosswinds of revolution and power shifts. Texas, which had been part of the Spanish Empire, was now a part of Mexico's northern frontier. However, Mexico's control over the vast, sparsely populated region of Texas was weak at best, and the newly independent Mexican government had little influence on the daily lives of its inhabitants. Initially, Mexico sought to extend its control over Texas by inviting settlers to colonize the land. The Mexican government hoped that an influx of settlers would help secure the border and establish a thriving economy. To encourage migration, Mexico offered land grants to those willing to come to Texas and start new communities. These land grants were primarily offered to Anglo-American settlers from the United States, as well as to Mexicans and other immigrants. One of the most prominent figures involved in this colonization effort was Stephen F. Austin, known as the Father of Texas. Austin, born in Virginia and raised in Missouri, had originally planned to settle in Texas in the 1820s after receiving a land grant from the Spanish crown. However, after Mexico's independence, he found himself working within the new Mexican government's framework to carry out the land settlement process. Austin was tasked with bringing settlers from the U.S. to Texas and establishing a community that would be loyal to Mexican rule. He successfully negotiated with Mexican authorities and established Austin's colony in 1821, the first significant Anglo settlement in Texas. Austin's settlement efforts were met with mixed reactions. While many Anglo settlers eagerly moved to Texas to claim land, Mexico's government had difficulty overseeing and controlling such a large expanse of land with minimal infrastructure. The settlers were primarily motivated by economic opportunity, and their loyalty to Mexican authority was tenuous at best. Though Mexico initially allowed a great degree of autonomy to settlers, over time, frustrations began to brew as the settlers realized that their freedoms were not guaranteed under Mexican rule. Stephen F. Austin played a crucial role in the early development of Texas, but he soon found himself caught between the demands of his settlers and the increasingly restrictive policies of the Mexican government. Austin's initial relationship with Mexico was cordial. He respected the Mexican government and sought to work within its framework to bring economic prosperity to Texas. However, as tensions between Anglo settlers and Mexican authorities began to rise, Austin's role became more complex. In the early years, Austin acted as a mediator between settlers and the Mexican government, advocating for settlers' rights while ensuring that they complied with Mexican laws. However, as the number of Anglo settlers increased, so did the pressure from the Mexican government to impose greater control over the region. Mexico began to impose stricter regulations on land grants, taxes, and customs, and this, coupled with the growing influence of Anglo-American settlers, created friction between the two groups. By the early 1830s, Mexico began to enforce laws that were deeply unpopular with the settlers. The Mexican government passed laws that banned further immigration from the United States and instituted tariffs on goods that were essential to the settlers' livelihoods. The settlers were growing increasingly dissatisfied with the lack of representation in the Mexican government, as they had little say in the decisions affecting their lives. These policies fueled a growing sense of discontent as settlers felt increasingly alienated from the government they were supposed to be loyal to. Austin himself, once a staunch supporter of Mexican rule, began to question the viability of working within the system. In 1833, he traveled to Mexico City to present a petition to the Mexican government requesting greater autonomy for Texas. During his trip, Austin was arrested and imprisoned for several months on charges of sedition. His time in prison only deepened his resolve to seek greater independence for Texas, and when he was finally released, he returned to Texas with a much more radical stance. By the mid-1830s, the situation in Texas had grown increasingly tense. The settlers, led by figures like Austin, William B. Travis, and James Bowie, began to voice their grievances more openly, and their demands for greater autonomy intensified. Mexico's government, under the leadership of President Antonio López de Santa Anna, responded with authoritarian measures, dissolving the federalist system in favor of a more centralized, dictatorial rule. Santa Anna's decision to dissolve the federal Constitution of 1824, which had granted Texas some degree of autonomy, was seen as the final straw for many Texans. In 1835, a rebellion broke out in Anahuac, a small coastal settlement, when Anglo settlers protested Mexico's efforts to enforce customs duties and suppress the growing movement for independence. The settlers, led by William B. Travis and others, clashed with Mexican troops, marking one of the first physical confrontations between Texan settlers and the Mexican government. This uprising was the first significant sign that Texas was moving toward open rebellion. As more settlers began to rally to the cause, the Texan resistance gained momentum. Several towns, including Gonzales and San Antonio, became flashpoints for conflict. The settlers, armed and united in their desire for greater autonomy, quickly turned from discontent to active rebellion. The Battle of Gonzales in October 1835 was a turning point. Texans fought off a Mexican force that had attempted to seize a cannon that had been given to the settlers for protection. The "Come and Take It" flag, which featured a lone cannon, became a symbol of defiance and resistance to Mexican rule. Santa Anna, furious at the uprising, marched north with a large army to crush the rebellion. The siege of the Alamo in 1836 would become the most famous event of the early rebellion. The Texians, under leaders like James Bowie, William B. Travis, and Davy Crockett, held out for nearly 2 weeks against Santa Anna's forces, but ultimately the Mexican army overwhelmed them. Though the Alamo fell, the battle became a rallying cry for the Texian cause, with "Remember the Alamo" becoming a symbol of martyrdom and a call for vengeance. Despite the heavy losses at the Alamo, the Texian resistance did not falter. Sam Houston, the leader of the Texian army, gathered a force of volunteers and launched a series of strategic attacks on Mexican positions. The Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836 became the decisive moment in the conflict. Houston's forces, outnumbered and cornered, launched a surprise attack on Santa Anna's camp, capturing him and forcing him to sign the Treaties of Velasco, which granted Texas independence from Mexico. The Texian victory at San Jacinto sealed the fate of Texas. After nearly a decade of increasing dissatisfaction with Mexican rule, the settlers' rebellion had succeeded. Texas declared itself an independent republic, and the Republic of Texas was born. However, the fight for recognition and legitimacy had only just begun. Mexico, under Santa Anna's leadership, refused to acknowledge the independence of Texas, and tensions between the two nations would continue for years to come. The seeds of rebellion had been planted in Texas long before the first shot was fired. But in late 1835, the revolutionary movement gained real momentum when Texan rebels began openly challenging Mexican rule. The first significant battle of the Texas Revolution occurred at Gonzales in October 1835. It began with a simple act of defiance, a cannon. The Mexican government had provided a small cannon to the settlers in Gonzales for defense against Native American raids. However, when Mexican authorities demanded the return of the cannon, the residents of Gonzales refused. The infamous "Come and Take It" flag was hoisted over the town, symbolizing the growing defiance of Mexican rule. The small Texan force, made up mostly of Anglo settlers, confronted a much larger Mexican force sent to reclaim the cannon. The Battle of Gonzales was brief, but its impact was immense. It marked the beginning of a full-scale rebellion against Mexico. In December 1835, the Texan rebels, laid siege to the city of San Antonio de Bexar, where a substantial Mexican garrison was stationed. The siege of Bexar was a pivotal moment in the revolution. After several weeks of fighting, the Texians, led by Stephen F. Austin and other local commanders, forced the Mexican troops, under the command of Martin Perfecto de Cos, to surrender. The victory was symbolic, showing the resolve of the Texian fighters and their ability to challenge Mexican authority. But it was also just the beginning of the conflict that would evolve into a struggle for independence. If there was one moment in the Texas Revolution that would become immortalized in history, it was the Siege of the Alamo. The Battle for the Alamo, fought from February 23 to March 6, 1836, became the defining event of the Revolution, shaping the identity of Texas and the United States. In early 1836, Santa Anna, the president of Mexico and self-proclaimed Napoleon of the West, led a large Mexican army to Texas to crush the growing rebellion. His forces headed for San Antonio, where a small Texian force of around 180 defenders had taken refuge in the Alamo, a former Spanish mission. Among the defenders were some of the most famous figures in Texas history, including Davy Crockett, the legendary frontiersman, James Bowie, a skilled fighter and military leader, and William B. Travis, the young and determined commander of the Alamo garrison. The Texans inside the Alamo knew that they faced almost certain death. Santa Anna had an army vastly superior in numbers, but the defenders refused to surrender. Over the next 13 days, the Texans held their ground, engaging in fierce fighting with Mexican forces. The siege was a battle of wills, with the Mexican army gradually tightening its grip on the fort. Inside the Alamo, morale fluctuated. William Travis, who was barely in his 20s, wrote one of the most famous letters in American history, calling for reinforcements and declaring victory or death. His letter, written during the siege, resonated deeply, appealing to the broader Texan cause. Meanwhile, James Bowie, who had fallen ill, could do little to command but was still revered by the troops for his reputation as a fighter. Davy Crockett, a former congressman from Tennessee, had joined the Texian cause, bringing with him both legendary status and a sense of patriotic duty. But on March 6, 1836, after an intense bombardment, the Mexican forces stormed the Alamo. The defenders, though outnumbered and exhausted, fought to the last man. The result was inevitable. The fall of the Alamo was a devastating blow to the Texian forces, with nearly every defender killed. Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and William Travis all died in the battle, cementing their status as martyrs for the Texian cause. Yet, the fall of the Alamo sparked a firestorm of rage and resolve across Texas. "Remember the Alamo" became a battle cry, uniting Texians in their pursuit of independence. Though they had lost the fort, the sacrifice of those at the Alamo gave the rebellion new life, rallying Texans to continue the fight for freedom. While the Alamo fell, the battle for Texas was far from over. The loss was devastating, but it galvanized the revolutionaries. Sam Houston, a former governor of Tennessee and military leader, was named commander-in-chief of the Texian Army. He knew that Texas could not withstand another major defeat. Despite the Alamo's fall, Houston's strategy was clear: to strike at the heart of the Mexican army when they least expected it. Houston's army, made up of ragtag volunteers and hastily trained militia, retreated eastward, hoping to lure Santa Anna's army into a false sense of security. Houston understood that time was on his side. The Mexicans, though victorious at the Alamo, were weary and overconfident. As the Texians retreated, they engaged in minor skirmishes, slowly building their strength. In April 1836, The two armies met near the San Jacinto River. Houston's army, numbering around 800 men, was still outnumbered by Santa Anna's troops. But Houston had a decisive advantage. He knew the terrain, and he had carefully planned the attack. The Battle of San Jacinto began on the afternoon of April 21st, 1836. In a swift and surprising attack, Houston's forces launched a surprise assault on Santa Anna's camp, catching the Mexican army off guard. The battle lasted just 18 minutes, but was devastating for the Mexicans. The Texians overwhelmed Santa Anna's troops, forcing them into retreat. In the chaos of the battle, Santa Anna himself was captured. Santa Anna, once the feared and powerful leader of Mexico, had been defeated and captured. His capture at San Jacinto marked the end of the Texas Revolution. Santa Anna was brought before Sam Houston, and after intense negotiations, the Mexican leader was forced to sign the treaties of Velasco on May 14, 1836. The treaties, though not immediately recognized by Mexico, effectively recognized Texas's independence. Santa Anna, humiliated and defeated, agreed to withdraw his troops from Texas and declare that Mexico would never again attempt to retake the territory. Despite Santa Anna's signature, the treaties were not fully accepted by the Mexican government. Mexico never recognized Texas's independence, and tensions between the two nations would persist for years. However, the victory at San Jacinto ensured that Texas had gained the momentum it needed to survive as a republic and eventually to join the United States. The fall of the Alamo, the victory at San Jacinto, and Santa Anna's eventual capture shaped the trajectory of Texas history. The Texas Revolution was not merely about military battles, it was about the desire for freedom and self-determination. The heroes of the Revolution, Davy Crockett, James Bowie, William Travis, and Sam Houston, became legends, their stories echoing through history. The Texas Revolution had profound consequences. It marked the birth of the Republic of Texas, a nation that would exist for nearly a decade before it was annexed by the United States in 1845. The battle cry of "Remember the Alamo" would remain ingrained in the cultural fabric of Texas, becoming a symbol of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience. In the years following the Revolution, the legacy of those who fought for Texas's independence would continue to shape the state's identity. The bloodshed, sacrifice, and victories of the Revolution would inspire future generations to hold fast to the ideals of freedom and self-governance, ensuring that the story of the Texas Revolution would never be forgotten. After nearly a decade of rebellion, warfare, and sacrifice, Texas finally declared its independence from Mexico on March 2, 1836. The Republic of Texas was born, standing as a new nation on the map of North America, distinct from its former ruler, Mexico. Yet this victory, achieved at great cost, left the fledgling nation with a host of challenges, internal, external, and economic. By the time Texas achieved independence, it had become a patchwork of military posts, isolated settlements, and fragile alliances. The revolutionary battles like the Siege of the Alamo and the victory at San Jacinto had burned through resources and left much of the population fractured. While the Republic of Texas may have been declared, it was far from secure. The Texian leaders, many of whom had led the charge for independence, were now tasked with forging a nation out of the ashes of war. Sam Houston, who had played a central role in the revolution, was elected as the first president of the Republic of Texas. But Houston's leadership would be tested not just by the scars of war, but by the delicate balance of power, resources, and diplomacy required to maintain an independent Texas. With its military power secured through the decisive victory over Santa Anna at San Jacinto, the Republic's next battle would not be fought on the field, but at the negotiating table and within the halls of government. Houston's first challenge was clear. Texas had to stabilize itself, both internally and in terms of its international relations. Though Texas was now independent, it was still a fragile republic. The new government faced immediate challenges that stretched from governance to foreign relations and economic survival. The Treaty of Velasco, signed in 1836 after Santa Anna's capture, had guaranteed Mexico's recognition of Texas's independence, at least temporarily. But while Santa Anna signed the treaty, Mexico refused to honor it, and the relationship between the two nations remained hostile. Internally, the newly formed government faced the daunting task of establishing a stable political system. The republic was characterized by a weak central government and growing discontent over the distribution of power. Houston's administration was initially focused on calming the nerves of an anxious population, rebuilding the military, and addressing economic instability. The national debt was astronomical, and the economy was nearly bankrupt. Texas relied heavily on loans from the United States and other foreign powers, but even these were precarious, as the republic lacked stable financial institutions and infrastructure. One of the major issues Houston's administration had to address was the question of land. Land grants, a source of wealth and opportunity for many settlers, were often unclear and poorly administered. The Republic of Texas lacked the formal structures to regulate land titles or disputes over property, which created chaos for new settlers hoping to secure their futures in the state. This confusion often sparked tensions, especially when it came to the large land grants offered to American settlers. At the same time, Houston had to contend with the growing political factionalism within the Republic. The political landscape of Texas was split between two major factions: the pro-annexationists, who advocated for joining the United States, and the anti-annexationists, who feared that such a move would mean the end of Texas's sovereignty. Houston, a moderate, tried to maintain a balance, but this issue would grow in significance as the Republic moved forward. Texas, now an independent republic, sought recognition from the United States and other foreign powers, but gaining that recognition proved to be far more difficult than anticipated. Despite the Treaty of Velasco, Mexico did not acknowledge Texas's sovereignty and maintained that the region was still part of its national territory. For the new Republic of Texas, this ongoing hostility with Mexico created an uncertain future. Without official recognition from Mexico, Texas was unable to join the United Nations or trade freely with other nations. The absence of diplomatic recognition hindered Texas's ability to form treaties or secure foreign loans that could have helped stabilize its economy. This diplomatic isolation became one of the most significant obstacles to the Republic's survival. In the United States, the question of Texas' future became increasingly urgent. Many Texian settlers, having fought for independence and seen the benefits of being part of the United States, eagerly sought annexation. However, annexation posed its own set of issues for the United States. The question of whether or not Texas should join the Union was deeply controversial. Many abolitionists in the United States feared that the annexation of Texas would mean the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, which further complicated the political calculus. The United States, while sympathetic to Texas's plight, remained cautious. In 1837, the Republic of Texas applied for admission into the Union, but the U.S. government did not act on the request. Even though Texas had established its own government, and its leaders like Houston and Lamar were actively lobbying for annexation, the Mexican threat loomed large. The United States, wary of provoking Mexico, hesitated. Some in the U.S. felt that admitting Texas would provoke a war with Mexico, which was already claiming Texas as part of its territory. At the same time, the Republic of Texas began to seek recognition from European powers. France, led by King Louis Philippe, was the first major power to formally recognize the Republic of Texas in 1839. This diplomatic success gave Texas some degree of legitimacy on the world stage, but it was a fragile recognition, dependent on the delicate geopolitics of European diplomacy. Great Britain also showed interest in Texas, particularly in light of its desire to create trade networks that bypassed the American markets. But even European recognition could not protect Texas from the continued threat of invasion or military action from Mexico. By 1839, the Republic of Texas had begun to face increasing internal strife and the growing realization that independence, while noble, might not be sustainable. Mirabeau B. Lamar, who succeeded Sam Houston as president, took a more aggressive stance in foreign affairs, focusing on expanding Texas territory and asserting its sovereignty. Lamar's policies were popular with many in the Republic, but they led to increased conflict with Mexico, particularly over the border and territorial claims. Despite Lamar's expansionist policies, the dream of annexation to the United States never fully faded. Houston, in his second term as president, was an advocate for peace with Mexico and pushing for U.S. annexation. He understood that the Republic could not survive alone in the long term. The economic instability, along with Mexico's refusal to acknowledge Texas's independence, made annexation not just desirable but necessary for survival. In 1844, James K. Polk, a strong supporter of annexation, was elected President of the United States. The election of Polk, along with the shifting political winds in both Texas and the United States, signaled the beginning of the end for the Republic of Texas. As President Polk took office, he worked tirelessly to secure the annexation of Texas. The United States, now ready to admit Texas into the Union, would set the stage for a dramatic and contentious period in U.S. history. In 1845, just 9 years after the birth of the Republic, Texas was officially annexed into the United States. This move sparked the Mexican-American War, as Mexico had never recognized Texas independence and was unwilling to let the region go without a fight. BY 1836, Texas had gained its independence from Mexico, but the journey toward statehood was far from smooth. The Republic of Texas was struggling to survive. Its borders were not recognized by Mexico, and it faced an ongoing threat of invasion. While many Texans hoped for annexation to the United States, the question of whether Texas should join the Union was far from settled. This debate would stretch on for years, touching on political, economic, and moral issues that divided both the Texans and the broader United States. The most pressing issue for Texas was the continued threat from Mexico. Despite the Treaty of Velasco signed in 1836, Mexico refused to recognize Texas as an independent nation. Mexican forces remained poised along the border, with Santa Anna himself vowing that Mexico would never accept the loss of Texas. For many Texans, annexation by the United States seemed like the only way to ensure the Republic's survival. However, the political situation in the United States was much more complex. In 1837, the Republic of Texas applied for statehood, but the United States hesitated. The issue of annexation ignited fierce debates in Congress, dividing the nation along political lines. One of the key issues in the debate was slavery. Many in the United States opposed the annexation of Texas because it would add another slave state to the Union, further tipping the balance of power in favor of the slaveholding South. Northern states, where slavery had been abolished, saw Texas's admission as a step backward in the battle against the expansion of slavery. On the other hand, many in the South viewed Texas as a natural addition to the Union. To them, the large amounts of fertile land in Texas were perfect for expanding cotton plantations, and annexation would secure economic opportunities. President Martin Van Buren, who served from 1837 to 1841, hesitated to annex Texas. He was concerned about the possibility of war with Mexico and the political fallout from such a move. Van Buren was wary of the tension Texas's annexation could cause with Mexico and the northern states. His hesitation allowed the debate to simmer, with both pro- and anti-annexation forces lobbying fiercely. John Tyler, who succeeded Van Buren in 1841, was more willing to take risks. Tyler, a former Democrat who had become a Whig, recognized that annexation would strengthen his political position. He also believed that annexing Texas would fulfill the manifest destiny of the United States, expanding across the continent to the Pacific. In 1844, James K. Polk was elected president on a platform that strongly supported the annexation of Texas. Polk, a Democrat from Tennessee, was determined to expand the United States. His election was a turning point for Texas, as Polk's victory ensured that the United States would take serious steps toward annexation. While Texas still faced internal division over its future, the tide in the United States had shifted decisively in favor of statehood. Even as the United States moved closer to annexing Texas, Mexico remained steadfast in its refusal to recognize Texas's independence. The question of Texas's border was central to the dispute. Mexico maintained that the southern border of Texas was the Nueces River, while the United States, along with the Texians, claimed that it was the Rio Grande. This difference of opinion would become a flashpoint, ultimately leading to the Mexican-American War. The territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was vast, wild, and largely unsettled, but it was incredibly important to both Mexico and the United States. For Mexico, ceding this land would be a recognition of Texas's independence and would mean the loss of territory they were not willing to part with. On the other hand, Texas viewed the Rio Grande as the natural border, and it was a region that was economically valuable for its fertile land and access to the river. When the United States annexed Texas in December 1845, Mexico responded with anger. The Mexican government declared the annexation an act of war. Polk, who had made the expansion of the United States his key priority, was ready to escalate the situation. He sent Zachary Taylor, an experienced military leader, to the Rio Grande region to defend the United States' new southern border. On the eve of the war, Taylor's forces were stationed just north of the Rio Grande, near the disputed territory. In April 1846, a clash between Mexican and American forces occurred at Paso de los Tres Brazos, just across the river from Texas. Mexican forces attacked the Americans, killing 11 U.S. soldiers. Polk, who had been looking for a reason to go to war, seized upon this incident and declared that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. With public support behind him, Polk asked Congress to declare war on Mexico. The Mexican-American War had begun. The Mexican-American War was fought between 1846 and 1848, with significant battles fought on both sides of the Rio Grande, in California and in northern Mexico. The United States, with a larger and more technologically advanced military, quickly gained the upper hand. U.S. forces under commanders like Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott, and Stephen Kearny pushed deep into Mexican territory. They captured key cities, including Monterrey and Mexico City, in a series of decisive battles. The war was deeply controversial, especially in the United States. Many in the northern states, including Abraham Lincoln and other Whigs, opposed the war, viewing it as an unjustified act of aggression against a weaker nation. The war's primary objective, acquiring land, was seen by many as a part of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. For others, however, the war was a reminder of the nation's violent history of land acquisition. By the time the United States captured Mexico City in September 1847, the Mexican government had little choice but to negotiate for peace. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. Mexico agreed to cede a vast swath of territory to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oregon. In exchange, the United States paid $15 million and assumed $3.25 million in debts Mexico owed to American citizens. The treaty dramatically reshaped the map of North America, expanding the United States by about one-third and setting the stage for further westward expansion. However, the land acquired in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was also the source of long-lasting conflict. The question of whether to allow slavery in these new territories would become one of the most divisive issues in U.S. history, eventually leading to the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo established the southern border of Texas at the Rio Grande, securing the land for the United States and confirming the Texian claim to the disputed territory. Mexico, despite the treaty, never fully recognized the legitimacy of Texas's annexation. The new border, however, brought clarity and brought an end to Mexico's military presence in Texas. For many Texans, the treaty was a moment of triumph, as it validated their fight for independence and secured their future within the United States. However, the aftermath of the war left behind unresolved issues that would continue to affect Texas for years. The territory that had once been part of Mexico was now part of the United States, but the incorporation of these lands was not without its complications. While many settlers moved west to claim land, tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions began to rise as the question of slavery in the new territories lingered. The fact that this new land was part of Texas brought even more complexity to the region's internal struggles, setting the stage for future conflicts. Texas's long history of battles for independence and the struggle for statehood was far from over. The political climate in the state remained volatile, especially as new settlers from the north and south poured in, bringing with them their differing views on slavery, land rights, and governance. The war may have officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but the deeper conflicts, racial, economic, and cultural, would continue to shape Texas for decades to come. In February 1861, after the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, a chain of events was set into motion that would fracture the United States. Texas, with its unique blend of Southern identity, a vast cotton economy, and a history of revolution and independence, found itself caught between the Union and the secessionist calls of its Southern neighbors. While some Texans initially hesitated, the prospect of Lincoln's anti-slavery stance, along with growing fears about the future of slavery as an institution, pushed the state towards secession. On February 23, 1861, a special convention was held in Austin, where delegates voted overwhelmingly in favor of secession from the United States. Texas officially joined the Confederate States of America on March 2, 1861, marking a significant moment in the state's history. The decision to secede was a reflection of Texas's economic dependence on slavery, the dominance of the cotton industry, and the state's historical tendency to favor autonomy over federal control. Texas's move was also motivated by the fear that Lincoln's government would undermine the power of the southern states, which were based on slavery and plantation economies. For many in Texas, the decision to join the Confederacy was one of unity with their southern counterparts. It was also driven by a strong sense of southern identity that had been growing over decades. However, this decision to secede didn't come without internal division. Many Texans, especially in the more urban areas like Galveston and Houston, were ambivalent or outright opposed to joining the Confederacy. These pockets of Union sentiment were especially pronounced in East Texas, where some regions had strong ties to the Union and were hesitant to break away. Despite these divisions, Texas fully committed to the Confederacy, with Texas's former governor, Sam Houston, one of the state's most revered leaders, refusing to take the oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. He was replaced by Francis R. Lubbock, a staunch supporter of the Southern cause. As the war approached, Texas became a vital supply line for the Confederate forces, providing both men and resources crucial to the Southern war effort. Texas's location, far from the primary theater of war, also made it a strategic haven for Confederate troops and war materials. Still, Texas's decision to secede marked a profound rupture from the Union, and the growing tension would soon give way to violent conflict. While the Civil War largely played out in the eastern United States, Texas played a critical role in the Confederate war effort, both strategically and symbolically. One of the key battles in Texas was the Battle of Galveston, which took place on January 1, 1863. Galveston, with its vital port, was one of the few remaining Confederate strongholds in the Gulf of Mexico. In late 1862, the Union Navy attempted to capture Galveston, which had fallen under Union blockade, in an effort to cut off supplies and prevent Confederate shipping. However, the Union's occupation of Galveston was short-lived. In a daring Confederate assault led by General John B. Magruder, Confederate forces launched a surprise attack, driving the Union soldiers out of the city and re-establishing Confederate control over the port. This victory was significant because Galveston was a crucial gateway for Confederate supplies, particularly cotton exports, and the Confederate victory helped boost Southern morale. The Battle of Galveston, while not a major turning point in the overall war, showed that the Confederacy could still mount successful defenses in key areas of the South. Later in the war, the Battle of Sabine Pass on September 8, 1863, would further cement Texas's role in the conflict. A Union effort to invade Texas through the Sabine Pass, a narrow waterway on the state's border with Louisiana, was thwarted by a small Confederate force. The Union hoped to seize the pass and cut off Confederate access to the Gulf of Mexico, but Confederate forces led by Richard Dowling managed to hold off the attack, inflicting heavy losses on the Union. The victory at Sabine Pass was one of the few decisive Confederate victories on the Western Front and a moment of pride for Texas. These battles were crucial for Texas as they helped maintain Confederate control over the state's ports and allowed for the continued flow of supplies and reinforcements. However, Texas was increasingly cut off from the rest of the South as Union blockades and raids on the coastline grew more effective. Despite some significant victories, the state was under constant threat, and the war was beginning to wear down the morale and infrastructure of the Confederate cause. The Civil War had a devastating impact on the Texas economy. As a state largely dependent on agriculture, particularly the cultivation of cotton, the disruption of trade with Europe and the Union had significant economic consequences. Cotton, which had been Texas's primary export, could no longer be shipped freely due to the Union blockade of Confederate ports. This, in turn, affected the livelihoods of many Texans who depended on the cotton industry for their income. The destruction of plantations and the loss of agricultural workers, many of whom were enslaved, crippled the state's economy. The Confederate government's inability to secure reliable supplies or maintain effective trade routes left Texas suffering from inflation and shortages of basic goods. The lack of adequate transportation infrastructure, which had always been a challenge for the state, exacerbated these economic problems. Goods were in short supply, and the people of Texas were forced to rely on makeshift systems to get by. Families faced food shortages, and as the war wore on, daily life became increasingly difficult. Texas society also began to change in profound ways as the war progressed. The system of slavery was the foundation of the Texas economy, and while it had been central to Texas's initial decision to secede, it became a point of tension during the conflict. Many Texas slaves, particularly in the southern part of the state, began to escape to Union-held territories or into Mexico as the Confederate defeat loomed closer. This shift challenged the fundamental social structure of the state, and while many Texans fought to maintain slavery as an institution, others began to question its future in Texas. As the war drew to a close, Texas was left with a fractured economy and a society deeply divided over the legacy of slavery. The defeat of the Confederacy was imminent, and while some in Texas continued to cling to the hope of Southern victory, others began to look ahead to what the post-war era would bring. The toll on Texas's economy and society during the Civil War would continue to have repercussions long after the war ended. As the war dragged on, resources in Texas became increasingly scarce. With a smaller population than the eastern states and a region largely removed from the main theaters of war, Texas struggled to supply its Confederate forces. As Union blockades cut off vital supplies, Texan soldiers and civilians alike faced shortages of food, clothing, and ammunition. The Confederate Army, relying on Texas to supply men and materials, began to feel the weight of its isolation. By 1864, Texas was becoming a backwater of the Confederacy. The key Confederate strongholds in the east were falling, and with each defeat, the confidence of Texans waned. Meanwhile, Union forces continued their raids along the Texas coastline and made several unsuccessful attempts to capture vital Texan ports, aiming to deprive the Confederacy of crucial resources. The exhaustion of war had worn down the Texan population. Young men had been conscripted into the army, and many others were sent to defend the state's borders, leaving farms and homes abandoned. The Texas military was stretched thin, and as it became clear that the Confederacy was losing, many soldiers were sent home, disillusioned and weary. The economy was crippled, and as a result, many Texans resorted to desperate measures to survive. Meanwhile, the Union blockade and the constant threat of invasion from Union forces further stressed the state's resources. The end of the war, when it finally came in 1865, was a harsh blow for the Confederacy. Texas, once a proud and determined part of the Southern Rebellion, was left in a state of collapse. The aftermath of the defeat led to widespread economic depression and a struggle to rebuild. The Southern dream had been crushed, and Texas had to reckon with the long-term consequences of its participation in the war. The end of the Civil War left Texas in a state of disarray. The once thriving Confederate economy had been shattered, and the social fabric of the state was torn. The abolition of slavery fundamentally changed the economy, which had long been dependent on enslaved labor to sustain its cotton plantations and ranching operations. The loss of enslaved workers, combined with the aftermath of the war, destruction of infrastructure, economic collapse, and political upheaval, left Texas in dire straits. It would take years of struggle and reinvention for the state to begin the slow process of rebuilding. During Reconstruction, Texas was occupied by Union troops as part of the broader effort to reintegrate the South into the United States. This period, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, was marked by significant political and social changes. Former Confederates were disenfranchised, and African Americans were granted freedom under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These changes radically altered the power structure of Texas, and many in the former ruling class resisted these changes. Governor Edmund J. Davis, appointed by the federal government, implemented reforms aimed at rebuilding the state's infrastructure and integrating freed African Americans into society. However, his efforts faced fierce opposition from conservative factions, including former Confederate leaders, which led to a tense and divided political landscape. In addition to political challenges, Texas faced enormous financial difficulties. The Confederate government had left behind a massive debt, and the state's credit was essentially ruined. The Southern Pacific Railway, which had been damaged during the war, needed to be repaired in order to facilitate the movement of goods across the state. Meanwhile, the cotton economy, devastated by the war and the abolition of slavery, was struggling to recover. Despite these hardships, Texas began to slowly rebuild its infrastructure, including roads, railroads, and the banking system. The arrival of the railroad in Texas played a crucial role in linking the state to national markets, providing the foundation for economic recovery. The post-war period was also characterized by the dismantling of the plantation economy. As former enslaved people sought opportunities for economic independence, many left the plantations to work on their own terms. Sharecropping became a widespread system where freed African Americans and poor white farmers rented land in exchange for a portion of their crop. This system kept many Texans in poverty, as the cycle of debt often left them at the mercy of landowners. However, despite the economic hardships, these changes laid the groundwork for a more diversified economy in Texas, one that would soon turn away from plantation agriculture toward industries like cattle ranching and oil production. In the years following the Civil War, Texas saw the rise of a booming cattle industry. This shift was driven by several factors: the changing nature of agriculture, the need for new economic opportunities, and the establishment of cattle trails that connected Texas to national markets. The open range, Vast stretches of unfenced land was ideal for raising cattle, and Texans began to see the potential in ranching. This period marked the beginning of Texas as the heart of the nation's cattle industry. The cattle drives, the movement of herds of cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas and Missouri, became iconic symbols of Texas's emerging ranching culture. The Chisholm Trail, a major route that ran from Texas to Kansas, became one of the most famous cattle trails. The demand for beef, driven by the growing population in the United States and the expansion of cities, created new economic opportunities. Ranchers, often from poor backgrounds, took advantage of the open land and cheap cattle to build successful enterprises. These cowboys, many of whom were of African American, Mexican, or Native American descent, played a vital role in driving the herds across the plains. Their work was grueling and dangerous, but it helped establish Texas as the leader in the American cattle industry. The rise of the cattle economy also brought challenges. Fencing laws, which were introduced later in the 19th century, began to disrupt the tradition of open-range grazing. As ranching grew, landowners sought to protect their herds from rustlers and wandering cattle, leading to the establishment of fences across the state. This, in turn, led to the end of the open-range system and a shift toward more organized ranching operations. Cattle ranching also faced the issue of cattle diseases like Texas fever, which spread when cattle were moved to areas where they had no immunity. Overcoming these challenges required new methods of cattle care and management, which were developed as the industry matured. By the late 1800s, the cattle industry was flourishing in Texas, and cow towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Fort Worth became hubs of commerce. The expansion of the railroad system was crucial to this growth, allowing cattle to be transported quickly to markets across the United States. The cattle boom was one of the key factors that transformed Texas from a state still recovering from the Civil War into an economic powerhouse. The ranching culture, characterized by vast ranches, cowboys, and cattle drives, became ingrained in the state's identity, and Texas beef became a symbol of the state's prosperity. As the 19th century came to a close, Texas was on the brink of another economic revolution. The discovery of oil would completely transform the state's economy and its place in the national landscape. The first oil well in Texas was drilled in 1866 in Nacogdoches County, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that Texas truly became an oil hub. The discovery of oil at Spindletop in 1901 near Beaumont is often regarded as the birth of Texas's oil industry and one of the most significant events in the state's economic history. Spindletop was a game changer. The well erupted with such force that it was visible for miles around, spewing oil into the air. This dramatic event marked the beginning of the Texas oil boom. For the first time, large-scale oil production was possible, and the potential for wealth seemed limitless. Entrepreneurs and oilmen flooded into the region, eager to strike it rich. The state's economy, which had been based primarily on agriculture and ranching, was suddenly transformed. Oil became the driving force of Texas's economy, and the wealth generated from oil drilling brought significant changes to the state's infrastructure, population, and culture. The discovery of oil also led to the rise of powerful oil magnates such as H.L. Hunt and Sid Richardson, who helped shape the state's economy and political landscape. The oil industry's rapid expansion created jobs and fueled the growth of cities like Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth. Houston, in particular, became the heart of Texas's oil industry, with major oil companies setting up headquarters there, and the city becoming a hub for both the oil business and the people working in it. The oil boom helped diversify Texas's economy, making it less dependent on agriculture and ranching. By the 1920s, Texas was producing more than a third of the country's oil, cementing its place as one of the most important oil-producing states in the U.S. The rise of oil also brought challenges. Environmental concerns about drilling practices and the effects of oil extraction on the land and water began to surface. Furthermore, the oil industry was volatile. subject to the ebbs and flows of national and global demand. The Texas oil economy went through boom and bust cycles, which created both tremendous wealth and devastating poverty for different parts of the state. However, the overall effect of the oil industry was undeniable. It positioned Texas as a crucial player in the national and international economy and set the stage for the state's future development. By the end of the 19th century, Texas had undergone a profound transformation. The once agrarian economy had diversified, with the cattle industry thriving and the oil industry emerging as a critical force. However, the state was still grappling with the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. While much of the state was rebuilding and recovering, the shift toward industrialization was reshaping Texas's economic landscape. The rise of the railroad had already begun to modernize Texas's economy by connecting it to national markets. As oil and cattle began to dominate the economic scene, the development of infrastructure, including roads, railways, and ports, became even more important. The discovery of oil led to a rapid influx of workers and capital, making cities like Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio major economic centers. Industrialization, though still in its early stages, began to change the way Texans lived and worked. Rural areas gave way to urbanization as people moved to cities in search of jobs in the oil fields, cattle markets, and factories. This transformation laid the groundwork for the modern Texas economy. While oil and cattle were dominant industries, Texas began to diversify further, becoming a center for various types of manufacturing, agriculture, and technology. The rapid growth of the oil industry created a demand for labor, and as a result, immigration increased. Workers from Mexico, the United States, and beyond came to Texas in search of work, helping to shape the state's diverse population. The economic transformations of Texas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries set the stage for the modern state. The cattle industry, which had provided much of Texas's wealth, began to wane in importance as oil took center stage. However, ranching remained an integral part of Texas culture and identity, and Texas's oil wealth helped to sustain ranching families as they adapted to changing economic conditions. The oil industry continued to be the primary economic driver for Texas for much of the 20th century, though it faced fluctuating prices, supply shortages, and environmental concerns. However, Texas's economy was no longer solely dependent on oil. The state's burgeoning industrial base, growing cities, and expanding transportation networks contributed to a diversified economy that helped Texas weather national economic downturns. Looking back, the economic changes that took place during Reconstruction and the rise of oil shaped Texas' future trajectory. From the cattle drives of the 1800s to the oil boom of the early 20th century, the state's economic growth was marked by a relentless drive to adapt, overcome, and thrive. Today, Texas is known for its powerful economy, driven by everything from energy and agriculture to high-tech industries and finance. This journey from a war-torn state to one of the largest and most prosperous in the U.S. serves as a testament to the resilience and ambition of the people who called Texas home. On January 10, 1901, an event took place that would forever change the course of Texas history. Deep in the fields near Beaumont in southeast Texas, a well known as Spindletop began to gush with crude oil. What began as a routine drilling project turned into a spectacular, world-changing event signaling the beginning of the Texas oil boom. The well erupted with such force that it shot oil hundreds of feet into the air, creating a scene that was both a spectacle and a symbol of a new era. Before Spindletop, Texas had always been a land of opportunity, with a booming cattle industry and fertile soil for farming. However, the state's economy was largely built on agriculture and ranching. The discovery of oil opened up an entirely new world of possibilities. The well produced an astonishing 100,000 barrels of oil per day, making it the largest oil strike in history at that time. It was a discovery that would not only transform Texas, but would also have far-reaching impacts on the entire nation and the global energy market. This discovery was made possible by P.T.O. Higgins, a local businessman and part-time geologist who had long believed that there were vast oil reserves under the ground in the area. However, it was the efforts of Anthony F. Lucas, a mining engineer, who drilled the well and proved Higgins's theory correct. The Spindletop oil field was soon recognized as one of the most significant discoveries in the history of the petroleum industry. The immediate effect was one of rush and chaos as wildcatters, oilmen, and investors flocked to Texas to capitalize on the newfound wealth beneath the earth. The Spindletop discovery was a game changer. Within just a few years, the Beaumont area became home to numerous oil wells, and the surrounding land once used for farming and ranching was transformed into a booming industrial zone. The sheer scale of the discovery and its ability to generate wealth at such an extraordinary rate would forever alter Texas's identity and future development. The state's vast open spaces previously used for cattle grazing would now house a new kind of power, black gold. The discovery of oil at Spindletop marked the start of a rapid transformation in Texas's economy. As the oil began to flow, so did the money. For the first time in Texas history, the state was on the map for something other than cattle or cotton. The oil boom ushered in an era of economic prosperity, attracting people from all over the country, as well as from overseas. Thousands of people descended on the Gulf Coast, eager to make their fortunes. New towns and cities began to spring up almost overnight. Beaumont, once a quiet town, exploded in population as it became the epicenter of the oil industry. The economic impact of the oil boom was profound. Oil refineries, pipelines, and manufacturing plants began to take root throughout Texas, creating an industrial base that the state had never before experienced. The rapid expansion of the oil industry led to the creation of tens of thousands of jobs, from drillers and engineers to laborers and support staff. The oil boom not only generated wealth, but also brought in the much-needed infrastructure to support Texas's growing population. Railroads, roads, and ports expanded, connecting Texas to the rest of the nation and to global markets. With new wealth came new challenges. The population explosion that followed the discovery of oil created significant social and economic pressures. The sudden surge in people caused housing shortages, poor living conditions, and overcrowded areas, particularly in the rapidly growing towns near the oil fields. While the industry brought riches to some, it also created sharp divisions between the wealthy elite who controlled the oil and the working class who provided the labor. As the oil industry grew, so did the gap between the haves and the have-nots, a stark reminder of the inequalities that often accompany rapid industrialization. At the same time, the Texas economy began to diversify. With the success of the oil industry came the rise of new industries related to energy, including natural gas production, petrochemicals, and manufacturing. Texas, once dependent on agriculture, had become a powerhouse of energy production and industrial development. The oil boom gave rise to a new economic structure, one that would endure well into the 20th century and define Texas' place in the national economy. In the wake of the Spindletop discovery, Texas witnessed the rise of powerful oil magnates who would dominate the state's economy for decades. These individuals, often described as self-made men, became some of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the world. They wielded not just financial power, but political influence that reached into the halls of government and shaped the state's policies. One of the most prominent figures to emerge from the Spindletop boom was H.L. Hunt, a Missouri-born businessman who made a fortune in the Texas oil fields. Hunt started with little more than a modest investment in the early days of the oil boom and quickly built an empire, making him one of the wealthiest men in the world. His success was fueled by his willingness to take risks and his uncanny ability to spot oil-rich land. His story of perseverance and entrepreneurship became the stuff of legend, and his influence on Texas and its economy would be felt for generations. Sid Richardson, another key figure in Texas oil, was known for his quiet, unassuming manner, but his impact was just as significant. With his partner J.P. Morgan, Richardson played a critical role in consolidating Texas's oil wealth. He amassed a fortune that would rival Hunt's, and he too became a major player in the state's economy. Both Hunt and Richardson understood the importance of controlling not just the oil, but the infrastructure surrounding it, from pipelines to refineries to shipping routes. Their efforts helped shape the foundation of Texas's modern oil industry. These oil magnates were not just businessmen, they became symbols of Texas's economic rise. Their fortunes contributed to the growth of cities like Dallas and Fort Worth, which became the new centers of power in Texas. Their investments in education, charity, and infrastructure left lasting legacies. However, their influence extended beyond business, as they used their wealth to gain political influence. Many of them became close allies of state and national politicians, pushing for policies that would benefit the oil industry and maintain the wealth that Texas had built. Their dominance in the oil market would create a powerful nexus of wealth, politics, and power, a force that would continue to shape Texas' identity well into the 20th century. The discovery of oil and the rise of the oil industry brought significant social and political changes to Texas. For the first time, the state was forced to reckon with the deep-rooted issues of wealth disparity, social mobility, and labor rights. The oil boom created vast fortunes for a select few, but it also highlighted the growing inequalities between the rich elite and the working class. As new towns and cities grew around the oil fields, the population swelled, bringing with it a diverse range of people. Immigrants, African Americans, and people from rural Texas flocked to the cities, seeking opportunities in the rapidly expanding oil industry. While the boom provided jobs, it also exposed the social divide. The influx of workers, many of whom were African American or Mexican, led to racial tensions, as these groups found themselves segregated into different parts of the growing cities and faced discrimination in housing and employment. This laid the groundwork for future social struggles that would shape Texas well into the 20th century. Politically, the rise of the oil industry changed the landscape of Texas governance. The oil magnates who had amassed great wealth began to wield significant political power. As they financed political campaigns and lobbied for favorable legislation, they solidified their control over the state's economic and political systems. The Texas Railroad Commission, which had originally been created to regulate the railroads, became the key regulatory body for the oil industry, ensuring that the magnates' interests were protected. While this brought economic prosperity to Texas, it also led to a political system heavily influenced by the interests of a few powerful individuals. At the same time, the rise of organized labor and labor movements in the oil fields began to challenge the power of the elite. Workers in the oil fields faced dangerous conditions, long hours, and poor wages. The growth of unions in the early 20th century would lead to strikes and protests, further challenging the social and political status quo. These movements would eventually play a role in shaping the state's labor laws and workplace safety regulations. In the early 20th century, the Texas oil boom set the stage for the state's rapid economic expansion. But as the oil wells began to mature and production slowed, Texas found itself at a crossroads. The state's economy, once heavily reliant on oil and cattle, had to diversify to maintain its position as a growing economic powerhouse. The era following the oil boom brought with it a new chapter for Texas, one marked by technological advancements, urbanization, and the rise of new industries. The mid-20th century saw a shift in focus from traditional industries like oil to the burgeoning sectors of technology and manufacturing. While oil continued to play a crucial role, Texas began to invest in other areas, notably in aerospace, electronics, and biotechnology. Cities like Dallas and Houston became hotbeds for industries that were at the forefront of innovation. In particular, Dallas became known as a center for high-tech companies thanks to the rise of Texas Instruments and the development of the Silicon Prairie in the 1950s and 1960s. Houston, too, began to evolve beyond its oil-based economy, with the expansion of its medical center, which became the largest in the world by the 1970s. This shift was fueled by Texas's growing education system, which began to place a greater emphasis on higher learning and research. The University of Texas, Texas A&M University, and other state institutions became key players in the development of the state's high-tech sector. The creation of research parks and the attraction of major international corporations further solidified Texas as a leader in technological advancement. These industries not only helped diversify the economy, but also transformed Texas from a state defined by agriculture and oil to one where knowledge-based industries became central to its future success. The Texas economy also benefited from the rise of global trade. Located near the U.S.-Mexico border, Texas emerged as an important trading hub, particularly in manufacturing, electronics, and energy. The state became an essential point of connection between the United States and Latin America, and NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1994, gave Texas companies access to a broader range of markets. By the turn of the 21st century, Texas had established itself as a diverse economy with strong footholds in multiple sectors: oil, technology, trade, agriculture, and finance. As Texas's economy diversified and its cities grew, the state's political landscape underwent significant change. The Republican Party gained strength in Texas starting in the 1970s and 1980s, transitioning the state from a Democratic stronghold to a Republican-dominated state. This shift in political power was not instantaneous. It was the result of various social and economic changes, particularly those tied to the civil rights movement and the political realignment of the South. The 1960s and 1970s were a period of immense social upheaval in Texas. The civil rights movement reached Texas, and like much of the South, the state was deeply divided on issues of racial equality and segregation. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had a profound impact on Texas. The legal dismantling of segregation led to a growing sense of empowerment among African Americans and other minority groups, but it also sparked intense opposition from conservative factions in the state. The late 20th century saw continued racial struggles, particularly in urban areas where inequality in housing, education, and employment persisted. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, Texas underwent a cultural shift that was intertwined with both political and demographic changes. As the state became more urbanized and more diverse, Texas's identity began to evolve. The influx of Latino and Asian immigrants, particularly from Mexico and Southeast Asia, helped transform the cultural landscape of Texas, making it one of the most culturally diverse states in the nation. This demographic change contributed to the evolving political identity of the state, as younger and more diverse voters started to play a larger role in elections. The rise of Republican power in Texas culminated in George W. Bush's election as governor in 1994, followed by his presidency in 2000. Under Republican leadership, Texas became increasingly known for its conservative values: low taxes, limited government, and strong support for the oil and gas industry. The political shift towards conservatism helped shape Texas' political discourse, both domestically and internationally. Despite the Republican dominance, the changing demographics, especially the growing Latino population, continue to challenge the state's political status quo, setting the stage for an evolving political landscape in the 21st century. Texas has always been known for its vast landscapes, but it's the growth of its major cities that has defined the state's modern identity. Houston, Dallas, and Austin, the three largest cities in Texas, have played central roles in the state's transformation, each contributing uniquely to Texas's social, cultural, and economic development. Houston, the largest city in Texas, and the fourth largest in the United States, has been at the heart of Texas's industrial and technological expansion. The city's energy sector, particularly its oil and gas industries, continues to drive much of its economy, but it has also diversified into healthcare and aerospace. The presence of the Texas Medical Center has cemented Houston's position as a global leader in medical research and healthcare. Houston's diverse population, with strong Latino, African American, and international communities, reflects the state's broader demographic changes, making it one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the country. Dallas, known for its financial power, has emerged as a global hub for corporate headquarters, technology, and telecommunications. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Dallas grew as an epicenter of commerce, banking, and real estate. The city also boasts a thriving arts scene, with institutions like the Dallas Museum of Art and the AT&T Performing Arts Center. With a growing tech sector, Silicon Prairie has begun to rival California's Silicon Valley. Dallas's development has reshaped its image, from a sleepy cattle town into one of the nation's foremost economic and cultural powerhouses. Austin, Texas's state capital, has seen a meteoric rise as a hub of technology and music. Known for its live music scene, particularly the iconic South by Southwest SSSW Festival, Austin is the cultural heart of Texas. The city's technology industry, anchored by the arrival of Silicon Valley tech giants like Apple, Google, and Tesla, has transformed Austin to a major player in the tech world. Austin's rapid growth has made it a magnet for young professionals and creatives, pushing the city's population to surge in recent years. Known for its progressive political environment and booming startup culture, Austin has become a symbol of Texas's modern, forward-thinking identity. Today, Texas stands as one of the most economically powerful states in the U.S. Its diverse economy, spanning energy, technology, manufacturing, and agriculture, has made it a key player on both the national and global stage. Texas has become known for its low taxes, business-friendly environment, and limited regulation, which have contributed to its rapid economic growth. Over the last few decades, Texas has consistently led the nation in job creation, attracting both domestic and international businesses. Companies like Amazon, Tesla, and Google have established major operations in Texas, recognizing the state's growing importance in global markets. The state's economic boom has influenced national politics, with Texas becoming a Republican stronghold in recent decades. Its political power has grown significantly, with Texas sending a disproportionate number of Republican representatives to the U.S. Congress. The electoral votes of Texas, now the second largest state in the nation by population, make it a pivotal player in presidential elections. Texas's economic influence, combined with its political weight, has made it one of the most powerful states in shaping national policies on issues like energy, immigration, and healthcare. The oil industry remains crucial to Texas's economy, but the state's diversification into high-tech industries, biotech, and renewable energy is positioning it for future growth. The rise of wind energy in West Texas, for example, has made the state a leader in renewable energy production, signaling Texas's willingness to adapt to changing global energy demands. The balance between traditional industries and new technology-based economies has positioned Texas as a modern powerhouse that both embraces its past and looks to the future.